Welcome to Working for Women, the Independent Women's Forum podcast, where we are changing the conversation about women and public policy for the better.
Hi, I'm Patrice Lee-Unbuka, Senior Policy Analyst with the Independent Women's Forum. And for today's program, we have Carrie Lucas, President at IWS. Hi, Carrie.
Hey, Patrice. Thanks for having me on.
It's always a pleasure. I mean, actually, today we're trading roles. Usually you're asking me the questions, but I get to interview you about paid leave.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Terrific. Well, this is really an interesting issue. I'm kind of excited to see it being debated alongside some of those traditional conservative issues. And you, myself, and other dads out there, we realize the importance of paid leave and, that peace of mind that being able to take time off to take care of, to have a baby or to even adopt a child is, especially without, the fear of losing your job. And so it's really been amazing to see this issue move on to the national stage from last summer all the way up into the president's budget proposal. We've been hearing lots of different types of proposals to deal with paid leave, and so that's where we're going to kind of jump into. Recently, there's a new report out from the American Enterprise Institute, which is a center-right think tank, and they've teamed up with the Brookings Institute, which is a center-left organization or think tank, to put forward what they're calling a bipartisan solution to paid leave. So, Carrie, I would love for you to kick us off talking about what this solution is and kind of the process they went through to get to it.
Sure. It really is. It's AEI and Brookings both are very serious organizations, and they do a lot of great work. And so it's no surprise that this report that they produced does contain a lot of great information about kind of the state of paid leave, the options that are out there, and then a rigorous analysis of kind of the pros and cons of those approaches. They did have a pretty large working group, and they're honest in the report of saying that there was a lot of divergence in opinion, and it was difficult to move towards a consensus. They do then come forward with saying that everyone in the working group agreed it was time for the federal government to take action and try to create a benefit, a guarantee for all working Americans. The compromise solution that they come up with is essentially a new federal entitlement program that would provide, I believe it was 6 weeks of paid leave and for up to 70%, replacing the wages by 70%. So if you were making $100, they would give you $70, or the federal government would give you $70. And up to a cap, so it would be, so that workers who make above a certain amount would be getting, not fully 70% of their wages. But that was basically their approach, and they would be paying for it by a payroll tax. And it's interesting to see that they went this far. I personally think there's a lot of concerns about taking such a one-size-fits-all kind of sweeping approach to providing a paid leave benefit. But that's where the AEI report came out.
Well, that's interesting that you talk about them taking such a sweeping approach. Let's back up and really identify how widespread is the lack of access to paid leave. I mean, is this really a big problem?
Well, it's interesting because it's certainly there is a subset of the population that lacks paid leave and could use more support. But I think we have to, again, even when we start looking at some of the numbers, you'll hear statistics like only, less than 20% of workers have access to paid family leave. Well, that's really not so, which would make you think that it's 4 out of every 5 workers is kind of suffering from a lack of this leave. But that's not what we're talking about. About 80% of full-time workers have access to some paid leave benefits, sick leave, vacation time, and those benefits can usually be used. Obviously, if you're having a baby or if you're adopting a baby, that's not something that happens kind of unexpectedly tomorrow. You have some time to plan. You can try to save up your vacation time. Instead of making a trip, you can kind of plan on having that vacation time. You're using it when you need to, when the baby's born. So a lot of people, when you look at what actually happens to new moms, more than half of them do have paid time off following the birth of a child. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody has the leave they want and everybody has sufficient time off, but I do think it's important not to kind of not to overblow it as if all workers are suffering from this. And we also, just as importantly, I think we have to remember that when we look at what workers lack and what problems we're trying to solve, yes, it's important to think about giving people paid time off from work, but we also have to recognize that there's a whole lot of people out there, too, who have part-time jobs and who can't have full-time jobs. So there's a lot of people, a lot of women out there who are, even those who are pregnant, who are saying, okay, sure, I'd love to have some paid time off from work. But you know what I want even more than that? I want a full-time job so that I can be earning money right now in anticipation of having that baby. So again, I think that you shouldn't look at this in a vacuum or oversimplify this as if all workers have a problem that government needs to come in and solve.
Well, it's interesting that that there's such a focus on moms. You tell me, who do you think should be receiving paid leave benefits? Because when we look at some of the different solutions out there, some are just for women, some are for moms and dads, and some paid leave policies are even broader than that. So can you talk about who's targeted by this policy, and who should actually be receiving paid leave?
Yeah, it's interesting because the AEI report talks about the need to make it gender neutral so that men as well as women have access to paid leave. And that's, and that's certainly a nice sentiment. Of course, just like we want moms involved in taking care of their babies. People want dads involved too. But it is interesting. But on the other hand, we have to recognize also that there's some drawbacks to this policy. Obviously, paid leave or these paid leave benefits don't come from nowhere. They have to be paid for. So they have to be paid for, and they have to be when workers don't show up at work, that falls on other workers. And so there is also a little bit of a matter of fairness. Of course, I'm a mom. I have 5 kids. I've certainly taken, I've been very aware that when, I take off time to give birth or to take care of my kids, that doesn't mean that the work I need to do disappears. That means somebody else is doing the work I have to do. And that's often women who don't have children, or men who don't have children, or men who do have children and have to take on responsibilities that are kind of outside their wheelhouse. So again, I think we do have to be real careful when we're talking about this, and recognize that there are issues of fairness. For every woman, we talk a lot about maternity leave, and of course, people need time off when they give birth. But then you hear about people dealing with serious illnesses, and you say, boy, it's kind of tough that when a woman has I was very fortunate. I have very kind of easy births and had some, I don't think medically, I'm sure it's great to get to take 6 weeks off entirely, but that's not something I probably medically needed. But then I hear some women who are facing other health issues and say, boy, it's not really fair if the federal government says, you have to get, or everybody owes you 6 weeks off to bond with your baby. But what about somebody whose kid has cancer, or who have cancer themselves, or some other serious condition? So that's why I think that it's, we have to kind of look at the big picture here and make sure that we're not picking winners and losers arbitrarily, and really be cautious about deciding how we're going to handle all of these situations, by making the federal government decide who it is that deserves these benefits and who doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, you touched on some really good drawbacks and challenges to this report. I'd love for you to expand a couple more. Especially when we look at plans overseas, other countries have instituted generous paid leave policies before, and have had some unintended consequences. So can you talk about some of the drawbacks?
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, when we look at what goes on in Europe, they do have much more generous paid leave, paid time off, much more than what AEI has been recommending for here in the United States. But it is kind of worth noting that employers, you love the idea of an employer being kind of blind to this and not taking into consideration who it is that's going to be exercising these leave benefits. But in the real world, that's just not how it works. And unsurprisingly, when you look at how things go in the EU, where where women often are taking months out of the workforce, sometimes 6 months or 9 months, women are much less likely than men to be in managerial positions. They're about half as likely as men are, where here in the United States, women are just as likely as men. And certainly part of that is because there is an expectation. When an employer looks at a woman in the EU, they say, oh, gosh, she's probably going to go, if she's married and she's in her 30s, there's a high probability that she's going to be disappearing from the office for months on end. And that clearly affects their expectations for what that woman or how they should be thinking about that woman in terms of her job responsibilities. And we don't want that to happen here in the United States. Right now, I don't think it does too much. And, 6 weeks is very different from 6 months. But it is something that people have to consider because, as you mentioned, I'm the president of the Independent Women's Forum, and not surprisingly, issues of maternity leave come up quite a bit at the Independent Women's Forum. We have people having babies a lot. I think that's a great thing, and we work really hard to try to support our employees when they are taking time off from work or when they have other challenges. But I also have to make ends meet. I also have to consider what's fair to our employees who don't have kids, not make sure that it's all they're always kind of taking up the slack for people who have family responsibilities. So, these are considerations that really, I don't think that I worry about the idea of a one-size-fits-all solution because this isn't a one-size problem. People have different, whether it depends on what kind of jobs you have, what kind of the needs of the businesses, as well as the needs of the workforce, what really makes sense. That's why I find I'm very hesitant. I worry about proposals like are coming out of AEI, which would really take a lot of discretion out of the hands of companies and just say, okay, federal government says here's how we should do it, so that's how we're going to do it.
And you touched on this a little bit earlier. The fact that it's paid, that nothing is, that this is a new entitlement that would be paid for, through things like a tax increase. They call it a modest increase, but that means that everybody is paying for it. That's that sweeping approach.
Yeah.
What do you think are the alternative plans that are out there that are probably a better way of approaching this?
It's interesting because this is I feel like we need to. It's really important for us to have this conversation because you're right. The way that the AEI plan would be paid for is by a tax on employees, so that this would be coming out of your paycheck, my paycheck, the paycheck of every man and woman working, whether or not they've had children, whether or not they plan to have kids, whether or not if they're gay or lesbian or infertile. There's a lot of things out there. A lot of people who might not use this benefit who are going to be paying into it. That might make people a little bit frustrated when it comes if we're talking specifically just about a paid parental leave. But then, so let's look at some alternatives. What I think is the most important thing is that we really should be trying to focus support and find solutions that directly provide aid to people who need it. If you're making a pretty good wage, if you're making well over the average wage in America, I think that you should be negotiating your benefits with your employer. If you're making have a good salary, then I trust that you're going to be able to figure this out. You may decide that you would rather have more take-home pay and less benefits, save on your own for time off from work, and make those provisions. I don't think it's the business of the federal government to dictate what every worker in America has in terms of their benefit package and how their employment contract should work. That's why I think we should really be focusing on low-income folks, people who it is when you hear the story of a woman who is struggling with a low-wage job, has a C-section, and doesn't have paid time off from work. That's the woman that we should be trying to figure out how to expand the safety net to help her. We've talked about ways like using the president has discussed possibly trying to find a way to have the unemployment insurance system step up and support a woman like that. I think that's worth exploring more. The Independent Women's Forum has talked about potentially using something modeled on the EITC program so that you could kind of give somebody like that a just-in-time boost in income to help through that time when she can't work. We've also talked about the importance of encouraging people to save tax-free for times when they times when they can't work, looking at something like almost a health savings account, but for family and medical leave benefits. So those are all approaches that I think we should be looking at. But again, I think we need to make sure we're defining the problem right and looking at those who really can't provide for leave on themselves that we need to focus our attention on so that we don't inadvertently harm women's economic opportunities, make our workplaces less flexible, which I think is what would ultimately a government entitlement program would do. So those are some of the considerations. There's no easy magic bullet to solving this problem, but so we need to really have a big conversation about the trade-offs of different approaches.
This has been really fascinating. I think I have maybe 2 more questions for you, Carrie. Now, this first is very fundamental. The authors at an event, when they released this report, they said the biggest headline is, it's not if the federal government should provide paid leave, but how they should provide paid leave. So that's a very fundamental assumption that they're laying down there. Do you agree or disagree with that statement?
Yeah, I'd say strongly disagree. I think that the federal government was created to do a few jobs well. Certainly the founders did not intend for the federal government to be in charge of deciding the benefit package for all working Americans. I think that's a tremendous stretch of what our government was intended to do. And as we know, every time the government steps in and decides, hey, we're gonna set the rules for this, and isn't it going to be great? We're going to make sure that everybody has X, Y, or Z. What we know is there's tremendous problems and unintended consequences. Essentially, creating a one-size-fits-all federal entitlement program to micromanage our compensations or how our employment contracts go, that's a little bit like doing what Obamacare did to our health insurance the system and saying, everybody has to have this kind of coverage. And we know that led to tremendous problems and dislocation. So I think that we should still there's a lot of questions about if the federal government ought to be in the business of deciding this before we take that enormous leap in giving the federal government control over this aspect of life as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that leads nicely into kind of a wrap-up question. If we have those conversations and the opinion is that, the federal government should be providing this, what do you think the likelihood of a plan like this would be to get through Congress?
Well, it's hard to ever know what Congress is going to be able to get past these days. Certainly, it's been funny because a lot of the folks on the left have really criticized anything that's come out of the White House, even when it sounds awfully like what some of them have proposed in the past. So given the gridlock in Washington, it might be hard to get anything through. But there's a lot of interest in it, and there is some support for proposals like this. So we definitely, that's a big question mark in my mind.
Well, Carrie, this has been a great conversation. I mean, this paid leave bun has been baking in the oven for a while. I don't think it's done yet, but we'll keep our eyes on it for when it is. So thank you to our listeners. We hope that you will join us for the next podcast. And thank you so much, Carrie.
Thank you, Patrice.
If you enjoyed listening to this podcast, please give it a thumbs up, share it on social media, or stop by iwf.org for similar content.